In this video, we will look at the sources and influences that helped shape the imagery found in alchemical books and manuscripts. As the alchemical manuscript tradition preceded the printed books by some 2 centuries, we will begin by looking at these early manuscripts. This is an example of a 14th century manuscript, now in Glasgow University Library. Within the text is a small drawing of a furnace. A manuscript in the Bibliothèque L'Arsenal, dated exactly to 1361, has some rather fine coloured drawings of alembics on a furnace. Another 14th century manuscript has a page with a number of drawings of alchemical apparatus. Early manuscripts up to the end of the 14th century only had drawings of apparatus. There is an exception with a Greek manuscript of the 10th to the 11th century, now in the Biblioteca Nazionale Marciana in Venice. This shows some stylized alchemical apparatus, a circular magical diagram with sigils, and most importantly a drawing of an Ouroboros. This sort of emblem, however, did not enter into the European tradition for some centuries. Among the earliest alchemical manuscripts bearing images is a work ascribed to Constantine of Pisa, his Book of the Secrets of Alchemy. This appears to have been written in northern Italy around the latter part of the 13th century. The text includes descriptions of imagery. The earliest manuscript of this which has survived is dated to 1361, but it does not contain any actual drawings. But the second oldest copy, which is now in Vienna, has pictures of these images. These attempt to present alchemical ideas within the biblical narrative. Thus, at the top, we have a depiction of the flow of water from the divine source to form the Caspian, the Mediterranean, and the Western Red Seas. These then water the Garden of Eden, within which we see the scene with Adam and Eve and the serpent. Lower down, under the moon, is a mountain from whose base flow 4 rivers. A bird has its nest in a tree and appears to be feeding its young, perhaps an image of the pelican. In the lowest circle is a triangle, probably representing the 3 kingdoms of nature, around which gather various animals and some plants. This is possibly the earliest example of alchemical imagery. Another early alchemical work, from the end of the 14th century, is the Wisdom of Solomon manuscript, bound up in the same volume as the previous item. One image shows Solomon holding a flask, at the mouth of which a red star appears. Within a few decades of this, extremely sophisticated alchemical imagery appears. Aurora Consurgens manuscript, now in Zurich, is dated to the late 14th or the early decades of the 15th century. It contains 26 emblematic coloured drawings in the style of an illuminated manuscript of the time. These emblems are complex, allegorical, and often resist simple analysis, and some of them are presented with no explanation or reference as to their content. However, a number of them do illustrate ideas in the text in a relatively straightforward manner. Thus, this image illustrates the text where it states, Aristotle called it the coagulum because it coagulates the water, which is the promised land, in which Hermes ordered his son to sow gold. Another example is of a rather gruesome image, however, simply explained by the text. It, meaning the philosopher's stone, is compared with 4 principal organs to be found within the human being, namely the brain, the heart, the liver, and the testicles. It is compared to the brain because of the coldness of the water, to the heart because of the heat of fire, to the liver because of the moisture of air, and to the testicles because of the dryness of earth. Within a decade or so, another manuscript appeared, this time in German, entitled The Book of the Holy Trinity. This contained a series of similar emblematic coloured drawings. Here they were explained in detail in the text, which used the Trinity and the Passion of Christ to allegorize alchemical content. Throughout the 15th and into the beginning of the 16th century, a number of alchemical manuscripts containing series of emblematic figures appeared, including the Donum Dei, the most precious gift of God, the Ashburnham manuscript of the Thesaurus Mundi, the Ripley Scroll, and later the now famous Splendor Solis. Of course, in these early times, such manuscripts were private documents, often owned by an individual, so these were not necessarily widely circulated. However, we find some reusing or at least quoting of images from early manuscripts, so there was some exchange of emblematic ideas. With the beginning of printing in the last half of the 15th century, we only find a few works on alchemy. The first example of a printed book on alchemy dates from the 1470s. This was a printed version of some of the works of Geber. These early editions do not appear to have any printed imagery, but by 1525 the printed works of Geber included some woodcuts of apparatus. Another early printed work containing woodcuts, again primarily of apparatus, is the Voarcadumia of Pantheus, first printed in 1530. It was not until 1546 that the first alchemical printed book containing emblematic images appeared. This was the Pretiosa Margherita Novella, the New Pearl of Great Price, written by an Italian physician and alchemist, Petrus Bonus, sometime before 1350. Only a few early manuscripts have survived, and I am unsure if they contained any imagery, but when this work was printed, it included a number of emblematic images, some of which formed a series based on the death and resurrection of a king of metals. A few years later, in 1550, the Rosary of the Philosophers, with its 20 woodcuts, was printed, contained in the compilation De Alchemia Opuscula Complura Veterum Philosophorum, several short works on alchemy by ancient philosophers. Here are the first 10 woodcuts of the series. The Rosarium woodcuts incorporated a number of images clearly taken from the Book of the Holy Trinity. But it also drew its imagery from a German manuscript created just a year earlier by Caspar Hartung von Hoff, which is now in the library at Kassel in Germany. In the latter half of the 16th century, printers of alchemical books sometimes incorporated emblematic woodcuts. Often these drew from the manuscript tradition. Thus in 1582, Hieronymus Reusner's Pandora included woodcuts of the 12 images of the Donum Dei series and 18 woodcut versions of the Book of the Holy Trinity. Woodcuts of the Splendor Solis followed in 1598 in a book entitled Aureum Velus, the Golden Fleece, and these were reprinted and reworked in a number of 17th century books. However, Alchemists and their printers were not merely plundering the manuscripts of some earlier centuries for images, as a number of books appeared with original emblems. This one is from Thurneisser's Quinta Essentia of 1570. Also, some alchemists or printers, it appears, decided that, as there were not enough manuscripts available to meet the demand of the alchemical audience, they would instead devise some. Thus, the fabrication in the closing years of the 16th century of the figure of a supposedly 15th century adept, Basil Valentine. Here are two woodcuts from the 1602 book of the 12 Keys of Valentine. These images are better known through the engravings created for a 1618 edition. The Valentine myth became so embedded in alchemy that most later alchemists unquestioningly accepted him as a real person. In 1612, a book entitled 3 Treatises on Natural Philosophy was issued in Paris. It contained the Book of the Hieroglyphic Figures by Nicolas Flamel, but now an image of a supposed carved stone arch he had erected in Paris, bearing images, was devised, and descriptions in the text of emblematic images in an ancient manuscript that Flamel had supposedly found in the late 14th century. Later books included depictions of the images based on the descriptions. Later in the 18th century, a revival of interest in alchemy led to the invention of a series of beautifully coloured manuscripts with versions of these emblematic figures. The emergence of copperplate engraving in the late 16th century gave alchemists and their printers a new tool with which to depict imagery. Woodcuts were relatively crude, with little subtlety, but now printers had the possibility to create wonderfully detailed emblems. An early example are the wonderful engravings included in Kunrat's Amphitheatre of Eternal Wisdom, first issued in 1595, and in an extended version in 1609. The small 1595 edition was hand-coloured. Engravings of alchemical emblems were included in many books printed in the 17th and 18th centuries. Among these were many complex series, including the 12 Keys of Valentine, the Azoth series, the 28 emblem series in J.D. Mylius' Philosophia Reformata, and the Mylius versions of the Rosarium, Azoth, and Donum Dei. The Lambspring series of engravings were taken from a late 16th century manuscript. This continued well into the 18th century, where we find the illustrations to the hermaphroditic child of the sun and moon, and the Carl von Ercker book, issued as late as 1779. So, from the mid-16th century, alchemical imagery left the confines of privately held manuscripts and entered the public space, which led to a proliferation of this imagery and its wider dissemination. The manuscript tradition continued, but now influenced by material in printed books. Printed books were copied in manuscript, sometimes translated from Latin originals into English, French, or German. Imagery was reworked. Thus the alchemical manuscripts of the 17th and 18th centuries lived within a different cultural space than those of earlier centuries, and we should see them as being less isolated, and indeed as reflecting the momentum of printed material. There thus arose a creative interplay between printed and manuscript material. We have now sufficiently surveyed the material to begin to sketch some of the influences that shaped alchemical emblems. Firstly, the early manuscripts clearly drew upon the existing manuscript tradition, its various forms and structures. Thus, the Aurora Consurgens is superficially similar to manuscripts on secular themes. An example being, say, the many illuminated manuscript copies of the Roman de la Rose, or of Ovid's Metamorphoses. The Splendor Solis, with its ornamental borders, clearly draws on the tradition of books of hours, and it seems likely that artists of some magnitude were commissioned to create the early versions of this work. A 15th century manuscript of Lull's opera Chemica even uses alchemical imagery within an illuminated initial. A major influence upon the alchemical emblems in the printed literature came from the tradition of emblem books, which began in the middle of the 16th century. This was a format of literature that emerged in printed books, with Andrea Alciato's book, Emblemata, of 1531. Of course, the integration of image and text was found in many earlier manuscripts, but Alciato gave it a new form by creating a format which linked together image and a text. His Book of Emblems was reprinted many times over the following centuries, and thus had a great influence on the depiction of imagery. As this format evolved, it became formalized with a motto or inscriptio, usually a short pithy statement heading the page. The image or pictura, as woodcut or engraving in the middle space, followed by a verse or subscriptio which amplified, echoed, or fully explained the imagery. Emblem books usually carried a religious, philosophical, or moral message. The imagery often came from classical mythology and was also informed by 15th century art, Mannerist, and later Baroque paintings. Emblem books continued to be produced well into the 18th century. The printers and artists who created the woodcuts or engravings for these evolved an emblematic language in which various pictorial elements were brought together, often in an unnatural way, which people today would readily, though falsely, label as being surreal. Usually the constellation of images was entirely explained by the verse. These printers were also often issuing alchemical books, and thus naturally drew on the same artists to illustrate these books. Thus we can clearly see a flow of this stylized imagery from the emblem literature into alchemical works. Here are 2 pages from Andreas Friedrich's Emblemata Nova, printed in 1617 by Lucas Jennes, who came to specialize in the production of alchemical books. Indeed, there were even a small number of alchemical works which use the emblem book format, the best known of which is Michael Mayer's Atalanta Fugiens of 1618. Mayer even extended the emblem book format by attaching a musical piece to each emblem. People today, with little or no grasp or experience of this emblem literature, often conflate this with alchemy, which is, understandably, easily done if one does not know the material well. If one isolates a picture in an emblem book and separates this from its text, it loses its semiotic situation and is then open to an erroneous recontextualization. How easy it is to see this emblem from brochures as part of an alchemical or hermetic work. These pictures in the emblem literature were never intended to stand alone. This image from Hensius, Emblemata Amatoria, of 1608, could easily be thought of as being from an alchemical book, rather than in its actual situation within an emblem book devoted to images of love. Alchemical emblems themselves also need to be viewed within their correct context. In the 1670s, Huyssin van Vreeswijk wrote a series of books on alchemy. Included in it were many engravings. These appear to be part of the alchemical tradition, as they have graphic signs placed on key elements of the images. However, as they do not seem to relate to the text itself, one needs to look elsewhere. It turns out that these images were taken from a well-known Dutch emblem book, that of Jacob Cats, which had gone through many editions before Van Vreeswijk found these in the edition of 1659, printed in Dordrecht. Van Vreeswijk's printer must have been able to acquire the original engraved plates and had the graphic signs for various alchemical substances scratched onto the surface, instantly recontextualizing them. The emblems in alchemy books were also likely to have been influenced by the woodcuts and engravings of artists outside of the printed book. From the 15th century, artists began producing printed material, thus enabling a single drawing to be reproduced and sold to a number of clients. Thus they evolved a pictorial language for expressing ideas. We can see a print such as that of Heinrich Aldegrever, a leader of the so-called Little Masters group of German printmaking artists, as developing ways to visualize spiritual forces that may have appealed to and influenced the artists creating images for alchemical manuscripts and printed books. A somewhat similar engraving from a few years later in 1569 by Hieronymus Olgiatus presents a complex gathering of emblematic images. It appears to portray transformations of the elements through the battle of a dragon and an eagle, which is being overcome by the Mercury figure. The Latin text states, "Matter in its various forms is seen to have become change, but it is wished for, understood, unique, and effective." This is a sort of imagery that becomes common in alchemical emblems over the next century. A series of large woodcuts of the planets appeared around 1533, just at the time when the first manuscript of the Splendor Solis was being created. These are now usually ascribed to George Pence, but other art historians suggest they are the work of Hans Siebold Beham, Albrecht Glockenden, or even his son Nicolaus. Whatever the attribution, it seems clear that the artist creating the original Splendor Solis manuscript drew from these printed images, though he did not slavishly copy them, but instead adapted them to fit the space, which now had to include the inner frame containing the flask. Sometime around 1540, the Italian Mannerist painter Domenico Beccafumi created a series of 10 woodcuts on the theme of alchemy. These are thought by some to be based on the book De la Pyrotechnia of his contemporary countryman Biringuccio, which was first printed in 1540, though the Beccafumi images may even be slightly earlier. His imagery is much more emblematic than the woodcuts in the Pyrotechnia, which are purely descriptive of apparatus and processes. Many such parallels can be found between the art prints of this period and the imagery in alchemical manuscripts and books. Relatively early on in the manuscript tradition, authors began to use schematic diagrams to represent abstract, philosophical, or logical concepts. In the medieval period, Aristotelian logic underpinned philosophy, and diagrams such as the squares of oppositions were created, which showed graphically the rules of deduction, the syllogism. Into these diagrams, the four elements were often incorporated, as in the image from Arance Finet in the first half of the 15th century. These ideas became taken up in later alchemical works, such as the Silva Philosophorum of Cornelius Petreius, a 17th century manuscript. Here the author draws on the conventional logic diagrams, but through his series of 8 images, he recontextualizes these as alchemical. Other geometric diagrams can be found in the various manuscripts by Raymond Lull on the art of memory. In this Lullist art of memory, key concepts were linked together using wheels, trees, and other forms of diagram. This was aimed partly at helping people to remember the various ways that ideas interrelated to one another, but also to exhaustively outline these interrelationships. Although Lull lived into the opening decades of the 14th century, many manuscripts under his name emerged over the following centuries, and only a small number contain his actual writings. His influence was such that later writers, promoting his ideas, did not think it right to add their name to the manuscript they were creating. So there is a mass of material that can be described more accurately as being Lullist. As we see here, one of the diagrammatic forms used was that of the wheel, often labelled with letters. Another diagrammatic form was that of the tree. Manuscripts and printed books of Lull's Arbor Scientiae usually included this type of diagram. This was a way of showing the hierarchical links between various categories of objects or components of human knowledge. His system continued to be studied well into the 18th century, and books about this were then still being issued. Shown here are 3 examples, among many, of alchemical emblems which appear to have drawn on this tree imagery. A number of early European manuscripts included cosmological drawings. Usually these contain depictions of astrological or astronomical ideas. Here are some from the 12th and 13th centuries. Most of these adopted a circular form. In the 16th century, this kind of cosmological image was translated into the form of woodcuts. Here are a mere 3 examples. We can see a trail of influence from such manuscript drawings and woodcuts into many later alchemical emblems, such as the wonderful and now well-known large engraving from Mileus's Basilica Philosophica, which bears a wealth of symbolism and has its central focus on a circular cosmological diagram. This image of an Atlas figure carrying the earth on his shoulders is found in Basil Valentine's Azoth series of 14 emblems. This complex circular figure is from the 18th century Kabbalistic alchemical work of Georg von Welling. his Opus Mago Kabbalisticum et Theologicum, which deals with the three alchemical principles of salt, sulphur, and mercury. There are a number of other influences, particularly regarding individual symbols and emblems, but these five main areas are possibly the most significant. However, there remains one last, clearly important source for imagery we can consider, though only as regards the picturing of alchemical apparatus in printed books. This comes from the books of distillation, which appeared in the first decades of the 16th century, some years before the printing of alchemical books gathered momentum. Foremost amongst these is the Liber de Arte Distillandi by Hieronymus Braunschweig, a practical guide to distilling oils from plants, the first edition of which was issued in the year 1500. This publication served to evolve a nascent chemical industry into a major component of the 16th century economy. The Braunschweig book contained a number of rather fine woodcuts, which clearly influenced later illustrators of alchemical books. We have now surveyed how alchemical symbolism arose from the background of imagery and emblematic ideas that existed in the European manuscript and printed book tradition. In the final part of this introductory series, we will look at how our modern preconceptions have significantly occluded the understanding of alchemical symbolism.